Ara Martinez stepped out of the dusty military jeep, her civilian clothes wrinkled from the long journey to the remote training base. The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she adjusted her backpack and looked around the sprawling compound. Barbed wire fences stretched endlessly, punctuated by watchtowers where guards stood silhouetted against the harsh desert sky. The air was thick with dust and the distant sound of marching boots echoed across the parade grounds. She had traveled nearly 8 hours to reach this isolated military installation, carrying with her a briefcase containing classified documents that required immediate attention from the base commander. As a senior intelligence analyst for the Department of Defense, Sarah was no stranger to military bases, but this particular facility specialized in advanced combat training and housed some of the most elite units in the armed forces. The importance of her mission weighed heavily on her mind as she made her way toward the main administrative building. The base was a hive of activity despite the oppressive heat. Soldiers in various stages of training moved purposefully between buildings, their faces stern and focused. The sound of rifle fire echoed from distant shooting ranges, while the rhythmic chanting of drill sergeants created a symphony of military discipline. Sarah noticed how the younger recruits seemed to move with nervous energy, their eyes darting constantly as they tried to navigate the complex hierarchy and unwritten rules of military life. As she approached the entrance to the command building, Sarah could see through the glass doors that the lobby was crowded with personnel. Officers in crisp uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, while clerks and administrative staff bustled about with stacks of papers and folders. The walls were lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders and displays showcasing the base's proud history and numerous commendations. Sarah paused at the entrance, checking her identification badge and ensuring her security clearance documents were easily accessible. She knew that gaining entry to the command center would require multiple security checks, and she wanted to be prepared for any questions or delays. The classified nature of her mission meant that even a minor hiccup in the verification process could result in significant complications. Just as she reached for the door handle, a commotion erupted behind her. A group of soldiers from the 45th Infantry Unit came marching past, their boots striking the pavement in perfect synchronization. These men had been training for weeks in the brutal desert conditions, preparing for a deployment that would test every skill they had learned. The physical and mental strain was evident in their faces, which bore the marks of exhaustion and frustration that came with intensive military preparation. Sergeant Rick Coleman led the formation, his jaw set in a permanent scowl that had become his trademark during the grueling training exercises. At 32 years old, Coleman was a career soldier who had worked his way up through the ranks through sheer determination and an unwavering belief in military hierarchy. He demanded absolute respect from his subordinates and had little patience for anyone who didn't conform to his strict interpretation of military protocol. Behind Coleman marched Corporal Jake Stevens and Private First Class Mike Torres, both young men who had joined the military with dreams of honor and glory. The reality of military life had proven far harsher than either had expected, and the constant pressure from their superiors had begun to take its toll. Stevens, in particular, had developed a chip on his shoulder about civilians who he believed didn't understand or appreciate the sacrifices made by military personnel. As the unit approached the command building, Sergeant Coleman's attention was drawn to Sarah standing by the entrance. Her civilian attire immediately marked her as an outsider in this world of uniforms and rigid protocol. What particularly irritated Coleman was her relaxed posture and casual approach to the building that housed some of the most sensitive military operations on the base. In his mind, civilians had no business being so close to restricted areas without proper escort and supervision. Sarah, completely unaware of the approaching storm, continued to organize her documents while waiting for a brief lull in foot traffic before entering the building. She was mentally reviewing the key points she needed to discuss with the base commander, ensuring that she would be able to present the classified intelligence in a clear and concise manner. The documents she carried contained critical information about enemy movements in overseas theaters of operation, intelligence that could potentially save countless lives if acted upon quickly. The moment that would change everything came when Sergeant Coleman decided to assert what he perceived as his authority over the situation. Without any knowledge of Sarah's identity, clearance level, or purpose for being on the base, he made a snap judgment based solely on her civilian appearance and apparent lack of military escort. This decision would soon trigger a chain of events that would expose the fundamental flaws in his understanding of military hierarchy and the true nature of authority within the defense establishment. Coleman's voice cut through the ambient noise of the busy base as he barked an order for his unit to halt. The sudden command caused several nearby personnel to stop and look in their direction, creating an audience for what was about to unfold. Sarah turned at the sound of the harsh voice, her expression showing mild curiosity rather than concern. She had no reason to believe that the approaching soldiers had any interest in her presence or activities. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would reveal not only the ignorance and prejudice of certain military personnel but also demonstrate the swift and decisive response that occurs when proper authority is challenged or undermined. What Coleman and his subordinates didn't realize was that they were about to make one of the most costly mistakes of their military careers, one that would have consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined. Sergeant Coleman approached Sarah with the confident stride of someone who believed he was about to correct a serious breach of protocol. His combat boots struck the pavement with deliberate force as he closed the distance between himself and the woman he perceived as an unauthorized civilian trespasser. The afternoon heat seemed to amplify his already elevated stress levels, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead beneath the rim of his military cap. "Ma'am, you need to step away from that building immediately," Coleman commanded, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he reserved for disciplining subordinates. His chest was puffed out and his shoulders squared in a classic display of military intimidation that had proven effective countless times during his career. Behind him, Corporal Stevens and Torres exchanged glances, sensing that their sergeant was about to make an example of someone who had violated base security protocols. Sarah looked up from her documents with a mixture of surprise and mild annoyance. She had been focused on her important mission and wasn't expecting to be confronted by soldiers who clearly had no idea who she was or why she was there. Her years of working with military personnel had taught her to remain calm and professional in tense situations, but she could already sense that this particular encounter was going to be more complicated than usual. "I'm sorry, is there some kind of problem?" Sarah asked politely, maintaining her composure despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. She kept her identification badge visible on her jacket, hoping that a closer inspection would reveal her high-level security clearance and put an end to what she assumed was simply a case of mistaken identity. Her tone remained respectful but firm, indicating that she wasn't intimidated by the aggressive posturing of the soldiers. Coleman's face reddened as he interpreted Sarah's calm response as defiance and disrespect. In his experience, civilians should show immediate deference to military authority, and her failure to appear sufficiently intimidated only served to escalate his anger. The physical and mental stress of the recent training exercises had left him with a hair-trigger temper, and Sarah's professional demeanor struck him as arrogant and dismissive. "The problem, lady, is that you're standing where you don't belong," Coleman snarled, stepping closer to Sarah in an obvious attempt to use his size and military bearing to intimidate her. "This is a restricted area, and civilians aren't supposed to be wandering around without proper authorization and escort. I don't know how you got past security, but you're going to answer some questions before you go anywhere near that command building." The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control as other soldiers and base personnel began to gather around the unfolding confrontation. Some watched with curiosity, while others seemed uncomfortable with the aggressive tone being taken by Coleman and his subordinates. A few of the more experienced non-commissioned officers frowned as they observed the scene, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the way the situation was being handled. Sarah realized that she was dealing with soldiers who were either ignorant of proper protocol or deliberately choosing to ignore it. She remained calm but decided it was time to assert her authority and clarify the situation before it escalated any further. Reaching into her jacket, she withdrew her official Department of Defense identification and held it out for Coleman to examine. "Sergeant, I am Sarah Martinez, Senior Intelligence Analyst with the Department of Defense," she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect from military personnel. "I have Level 5 security clearance and am here on official business with your base commander. I suggest you examine my credentials before making any further assumptions about my authorization to be here." Instead of examining the identification as any reasonable soldier should have done, Coleman knocked Sarah's hand away with unnecessary force, causing her badge and documents to scatter across the hot pavement. The aggressive action sent shockwaves through the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom recognized that assaulting a senior Department of Defense official was a career-ending mistake of monumental proportions. "I don't care what kind of fancy badge you think you have," Coleman shouted, his voice now attracting attention from personnel throughout the immediate area. "Nobody gets special treatment on my watch, and you're going to learn what happens when civilians try to throw their weight around on a military installation. Stevens, Torres, escort this woman to the security office for questioning. And, if she gives you any trouble, you have my permission to use whatever force is necessary." The two younger soldiers looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they were being ordered to participate in what appeared to be a serious violation of military protocol. Both Stevens and Torres had enough training to recognize that assaulting someone with high-level security clearance could result in court-martial proceedings and lengthy prison sentences. However, their ingrained respect for the chain of command and fear of disobeying a direct order from their sergeant left them paralyzed with indecision. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked as she realized that Coleman was either completely ignorant of military regulations or was deliberately choosing to ignore them. The assault on her person and the destruction of her official documents constituted serious federal crimes, and she knew that the consequences for these soldiers would be severe and swift. However, her immediate concern was completing her mission and getting the critical intelligence information to the base commander before any delays could compromise ongoing operations. "Sergeant Coleman, you are making a terrible mistake," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying a warning that any experienced soldier should have recognized. "I am here on direct orders from the Pentagon, carrying classified intelligence that requires immediate attention from your commanding officer. What you're doing right now constitutes assault on a federal official and obstruction of a classified military operation. I strongly advise you to step back and allow me to proceed with my authorized mission." Coleman's response was to grab Sarah's arm roughly and begin pulling her toward the security office, while motioning for his subordinates to follow. The crowd of onlookers had grown substantially, and many of the more senior personnel were reaching for their communication devices, recognizing that this situation required immediate intervention from higher authorities. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone present realized they were witnessing what could only be described as a complete breakdown of military discipline and protocol. What none of the soldiers involved in the confrontation realized was that their actions were being observed by multiple security cameras positioned throughout the base, and that automated alert systems had already begun notifying senior command staff of the unusual activity near the restricted command building. The wheels of military justice were already beginning to turn, and the consequences of their actions would soon become apparent in ways that would exceed their worst nightmares. The base command center's emergency alert system began flashing red as Senior Communications Officer Captain Jennifer Walsh observed the security camera feeds showing an unprecedented breach of protocol occurring near the main administrative building. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize when routine security matters escalated into serious incidents requiring immediate command intervention. What she was witnessing through the high-definition surveillance equipment was far beyond anything she had encountered in her distinguished military career. Captain Walsh immediately activated the emergency communication protocol, sending priority alerts to the three most senior officers currently on the base. The gravity of the situation demanded swift action from the highest levels of military authority, as the assault and detention of a senior Department of Defense official constituted a breach of federal law that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire installation and everyone involved. Within minutes of the alert being transmitted, the rapid response was mobilized with military precision that demonstrated why these particular officers had risen to positions of supreme authority. The first to respond was Lieutenant General Patricia Harrison, a decorated veteran with over 30 years of distinguished service who commanded respect throughout the entire military establishment. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun beneath her perfectly positioned cap, and her numerous ribbons and medals testified to a career marked by exceptional leadership during the most challenging periods of modern military history. General Harrison had been reviewing classified briefings in the secure conference room when the priority alert reached her personal communication device. The message was brief but alarming: unauthorized detention and assault of DoD official Sarah Martinez by personnel from the 45th Infantry Unit. Harrison immediately recognized the name from recent Pentagon correspondence regarding critical intelligence operations, and she knew that any interference with Martinez's mission could have far-reaching consequences for national security operations. The second officer to receive the emergency notification was Major General Robert Chen, the base's commanding officer and a man whose reputation for swift and decisive action was legendary throughout military circles. Chen had built his career on maintaining absolute discipline and ensuring that every soldier under his command understood and respected the complex hierarchy that governed military operations. The news that some of his personnel had apparently assaulted a senior DoD official sent waves of anger and disbelief through his normally composed demeanor. General Chen was in the middle of a video conference with Pentagon officials when his aide burst into the room with the emergency alert. The irony was not lost on him that he was discussing operational security and discipline standards at the exact moment when soldiers under his command were committing what amounted to career-ending violations of military law. Chen immediately terminated the conference and began issuing rapid-fire orders to his staff, demanding that security teams mobilize to the scene immediately. The third member of the response team was Brigadier General Michael Rodriguez, the installation's chief of security and a man whose expertise in military law enforcement had earned him recognition throughout the Department of Defense. Rodriguez had spent the afternoon reviewing security protocols and training procedures, work that made the current crisis particularly galling as it represented a complete failure of the systems he had worked so hard to implement and maintain. All three generals converged on the scene with an escort of military police officers and senior non-commissioned officers who understood the seriousness of the situation. Their vehicles approached the administrative building with emergency lights flashing, creating an impressive display of military authority that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the immediate area. The sight of three general officers responding personally to an incident was unprecedented in the recent history of the base, and word spread quickly throughout the installation that something extraordinary was happening. Meanwhile, Sergeant Coleman and his subordinates remained completely oblivious to the storm that was bearing down upon them. Coleman continued to manhandle Sarah toward the security office, while Stevens and Torres followed reluctantly behind, their discomfort growing with each step. The crowd of onlookers had swelled to include personnel from multiple units, many of whom were documenting the incident with their personal devices despite regulations prohibiting such recordings in sensitive areas. Sarah had ceased her protests and was now mentally documenting every aspect of the assault for the formal complaints and legal proceedings that she knew would inevitably follow. Her years of experience with military bureaucracy had taught her that detailed records and witness testimony would be crucial in ensuring that the appropriate consequences were imposed on the soldiers who had violated federal law. She also knew that the longer this incident continued, the more severe the repercussions would become for everyone involved. The dramatic moment of reckoning arrived when the convoy of command vehicles screeched to a halt just meters from where Coleman was attempting to force Sarah into the security building. The simultaneous arrival of three general officers created an instant silence that fell over the entire area like a heavy blanket. Even Coleman, despite his apparent ignorance of military protocol, recognized that something significant was happening when he saw the high-ranking officers emerging from their vehicles with expressions of barely controlled fury. Lieutenant General Harrison was the first to speak, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding entire military operations. "Sergeant Coleman, release that woman immediately and step away from her," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument or hesitation. The power and authority in her voice was so commanding that even the most hardened soldiers in the vicinity felt compelled to stand at attention. Coleman's face went pale as he realized that he was being directly addressed by a three-star general, but his pride and stubbornness prevented him from immediately comprehending the magnitude of his mistake. "Ma'am, this civilian was attempting to breach security protocols, and I was following proper procedure by detaining her for questioning," he replied, his voice wavering slightly as he began to sense that his interpretation of events might not align with that of his superiors. Major General Chen stepped forward, his expression darker than anyone present had ever witnessed. "Sergeant, you are currently assaulting Sarah Martinez, a senior intelligence analyst with Level 5 security clearance who is here on direct orders from the Secretary of Defense," he said, each word delivered with the precision of a military tribunal pronouncement. "You have violated federal law, compromised a classified operation, and brought disgrace upon this installation and everyone associated with it." The color drained completely from Coleman's face as the reality of his situation began to penetrate through his arrogance and ignorance. Stevens and Torres immediately stepped back from their sergeant, recognizing that their proximity to him could be interpreted as complicity in what was clearly a catastrophic breach of military discipline. The crowd of onlookers had grown to include soldiers from throughout the base, all of whom were witnessing what would become a legendary example of how quickly military careers could be destroyed through poor judgment and failure to follow proper protocols. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled military justice system that had been perfected through decades of maintaining discipline and order. Brigadier General Rodriguez immediately took charge of the security aspects of the situation, ordering his military police officers to secure the area and begin documenting evidence for the formal proceedings that would inevitably follow. The gravity of the situation demanded thoroughness and attention to detail that would ensure no aspect of the incident escaped official scrutiny. Lieutenant General Harrison personally approached Sarah, her demeanor shifting from commanding authority to professional courtesy as she addressed the senior DoD official who had been subjected to such outrageous treatment. Ms. Martinez, I offer you the sincere apologies of this command for the completely unacceptable behavior you have experienced, Harrison said, her voice carrying both genuine regret and steely determination. I want to assure you that this incident will be investigated thoroughly and that appropriate action will be taken against all personnel involved. Sarah straightened her clothing and gathered her scattered documents with the assistance of several nearby officers who were eager to demonstrate their respect and professionalism in contrast to the appalling behavior they had just witnessed. Despite the physical and emotional trauma of the assault, Sarah maintained her composure and professional dignity, understanding that her response to this crisis would be closely observed and evaluated by senior military leadership. General Harrison, I appreciate your prompt response to this situation, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the stress she had endured. My primary concern at this moment is completing the classified briefing I was scheduled to deliver to your base commander. The intelligence I'm carrying is time-sensitive and critical to ongoing operations that cannot be delayed by this unfortunate incident. Major General Chen immediately stepped forward to address Sarah's operational concerns, recognizing that the mission she had traveled so far to complete took precedence over the administrative consequences of his subordinates' misconduct. Ms. Martinez, I am the base commander, and I'm prepared to receive your briefing immediately, he said, gesturing toward the command building. We have secure facilities available for classified discussions, and I want to ensure that this incident causes no further delays to your important work. While Sarah and the general officers moved toward the command building to address the urgent intelligence matters, the three soldiers who had created this crisis found themselves facing the swift and merciless consequences of their actions. Military police officers had already begun the formal arrest procedures, reading each man his rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice while securing evidence and taking statements from the numerous witnesses who had observed their misconduct. Sergeant Coleman stood in stunned silence as the reality of his situation finally penetrated through his arrogance and denial. The career he had spent over a decade building was crumbling before his eyes, destroyed by a few minutes of poor judgment and fundamental misunderstanding of military authority. The assault charges alone carried the potential for significant prison time, while the obstruction of a classified operation added federal implications that could result in decades of incarceration. Stevens and Torres faced their own reckoning as military investigators began determining the extent of their complicity in the assault and detention of a senior federal official. While their direct participation had been limited compared to Coleman's aggressive leadership, their failure to refuse an obviously illegal order and their assistance in the attempted detention would likely result in serious disciplinary action and potential criminal charges. The most dramatic consequence of the incident came when Lieutenant General Harrison made the decision that would send shockwaves throughout the entire military establishment. After conferring with Major General Chan and reviewing the personnel files of the 45th Infantry Unit, she determined that the misconduct of Coleman and his subordinates was symptomatic of broader leadership and discipline problems that required immediate and decisive action. Major General Chan, I am ordering the immediate disbandment of the 45th Infantry Unit, Harrison announced, her words carrying the weight of absolute authority. The failure of leadership demonstrated by Sergeant Coleman, combined with the apparent willingness of his subordinates to participate in the assault of a federal official, indicates fundamental problems with the unit's training, discipline, and command structure that cannot be corrected through conventional disciplinary measures. The announcement sent waves of shock through the assembled crowd as soldiers realized they were witnessing military justice being administered at the highest level. The disbandment of an entire unit was an extremely rare occurrence that would be discussed and analyzed throughout military circles for years to come. Every member of the 45th Infantry Unit would face individual review to determine their fitness for continued military service, with many likely facing reassignment, additional training, or discharge from the armed forces. The news of the unit's disbandment spread throughout the base with lightning speed, reaching every corner of the installation within hours. Soldiers who had no connection to the incident found themselves discussing the consequences of poor leadership and the importance of understanding proper military protocol. The story became a cautionary tale that would be referenced in military training programs and leadership courses for generations of future service members. Sarah completed her classified briefing with Major General Chen in the secure conference room, delivering critical intelligence about enemy movements and operational security concerns that would inform strategic decisions at the highest levels of command. Despite the traumatic experience she had endured, her professionalism and dedication to duty ensured that the mission was accomplished successfully and that vital national security information reached the appropriate authorities without further delay. The legal proceedings that followed the incident moved through the military justice system with efficiency and thoroughness that demonstrated the serious consequences of assaulting federal officials and obstructing classified operations. Coleman faced court-martial on multiple charges including assault, battery, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. His conviction resulted in reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 18 months, and dismissal from military service with a dishonorable discharge. Stevens and Torres received lesser but still significant punishments through non-judicial proceedings, with both soldiers facing reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and reassignment to different installations where they would undergo additional training in military protocol and proper respect for authority. Their military careers were permanently damaged by their association with the incident, serving as a reminder to all service members about the importance of refusing to participate in illegal orders regardless of pressure from superiors. The lasting impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants, as military installations throughout the country implemented enhanced training programs designed to ensure that all personnel understood the proper protocols for interacting with civilian officials and federal employees. Sarah's experience became a case study in military leadership courses, highlighting the catastrophic consequences that could result from ignorance, prejudice, and failure to follow established procedures. Years later, the story continued to resonate throughout military and civilian circles as an example of how quickly authority could be asserted when proper channels were activated and how devastating the consequences could be for those who chose to abuse their positions or misunderstand the complex hierarchies that governed military operations. The swift disbandment of the 45th Infantry Unit became legendary as an example of decisive leadership and the absolute intolerance for misconduct that characterized the highest levels of military command.